But the point of the matter is that there had been from the very beginning a connection between Jewish lawyers and Jewish law firms and the creation of the black corporate bar. But the story's more complicated than that, because beginning in the 1960s and through the 1970s, a series of tensions developed that actually haven't been mentioned here at this conference between the black and the Jewish community. So Judge Carter, for example, when he was brought into Battle Fowler, he was doing, to the Paletti firm, was doing labor law. But after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and increasingly into the early 1970s until he was actually appointed a federal judge by Richard Nixon, labor law increasingly became anti-discrimination law. And that the practice became representing companies and labor unions, in the Paletti's case, who were charged with discrimination often against black members. In 1978, of course, the Bakke decision happened, and affirmative action becomes a major cleavage between the black community and the Jewish community. Ann Southworth, I think, told me I had her statistics wrong. I think Anna's over there. I can't see her because of this post in the way. Hi, Ann. So how many lawyers was it? It was just one. It was 6% of the sample. But, you know, so one of the lawyers in her conservative sample was working on anti-affirmative action legislation. There's been a lot of debate. I think some of the conflict between the black and the Jewish community was raised over issues of reapportionment. Somebody said in the back here. The point is there became issues that caused tension between these communities which had worked together. One major one I don't have to tell anyone here about, of course, is the Middle East. Where issues involving Israel and the Palestinian conflict became a serious source of cleavage between the black and the Jewish community. And perhaps most significantly, there was a changing of the generation, both the generation of black lawyers and the generation of Jewish lawyers. The original generation of black lawyers moving into large law firms were people who had been grown up in very much the kind of assimilationist tradition. Just remove anti-discrimination and let us in the door. The later generation, my generation, was much more growing up in what might be called the Black Power movement, a movement in which there were many tensions between blacks and Jews. And similarly, the generation of Jews was changing. So when the earliest black lawyers came, the Jews who were there in law firms were oftentimes the ones who had a very sharp memory of discrimination against them. There is a wonderful story, which in the interest of time I won't read you, of one of my interviewees, and a lot of this is based on over 200 lawyers who I've interviewed for a forthcoming book, that came to work. He had been hired at actually a major Jewish law firm. He was given a start. He told them when he'd like to start. He showed up there and the law firm was closed. Why? Because it was Rosh Hashanah. And no one had told him. So he shows up and the law firm's closed. But in a wonderful story, one of the senior partners in the firm had come to work that day because he didn't want him to come to the law firm when it was closed. They go out to lunch because the law firm's closed. There's nothing for him to do. And they develop a relationship in which this senior Jewish lawyer becomes a great mentor to this lawyer, this black lawyer, helping him along the way. And I asked him, well, did you ever ask him, why do you think this happened? He said, on the one hand, we had nothing in common. And on the other hand, one day when this senior Jewish lawyer was talking about his own experience of law school and being turned down or not given an interview at Cravath or Sullivan and Cromwell, maybe I shouldn't say, oh, he's gone, Sullivan and Cromwell or some of the other major law firms, that he said, I think he could understand what it was like to be the only outsider in the group. Over time, that generation, which had personally experienced that kind of discrimination in law firms, was replaced by a generation whose memory was of the role of Jewish lawyers in the civil rights movement, of I marched or my father marched with Martin, and that there was less of a recognition of personal discrimination and more of I understand you. And in fact, I not only understand you, but as I'll say in a second, maybe have been there and overcome your problems, creating a tension between the black lawyers and the Jewish lawyers. So it's against this context that black lawyers, beginning in the late 1980s, began to think maybe instead of trying to integrate law firms from the bottom up, maybe we should create competitors. Maybe we should create competitors. Now, it's a sign of the fact that we don't study history very well, and perhaps a sign of the fracturing of the relationship between blacks and Jews, that most of the people who started these black corporate law firms in the late 1980s, early 1990s, did not think of themselves as patterning themselves off of the successful rise and transformation of the Jewish law firm. In fact, when I'd asked them about it, it never occurred to them, actually. Instead, what they saw themselves doing was trying to carve out another path to opportunity. Now, Ellie, I think, has done a brilliant job of charting the reasons why Jewish law firms were able to be successful in the period between 1945 to 1960s, and he's already given you a hint of why the story might be different for black law firms. But let me just say why initially these law firms were successful and how those factors were different than the factors that Ellie suggested were true for the Jewish law firm. So one issue simply that happened was there was a frustration with the pace of change by people who had been successful. That is, the people who started these black corporate law firms actually were primarily partners who had actually succeeded in the large law firms, but felt that they were not able to become significant partners. They weren't able to become, as I wrote in an article, partners with power, people who could command client relationships. And so they were frustrated, not with the sense that they didn't get hired or even that they didn't succeed, but that they couldn't win by the terms of what those organizations were all about. Second, they were in some sense encouraged to think that they might be able to succeed on their own by the potential to translate public power into private power. So one of the things that was happening in the 1980s was that blacks were becoming either majorities or significant minorities in many major urban areas, that there were the elections of black mayors in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Atlanta, eventually here in New York City, and that cities control substantial legal business. And that one of those things those black mayors began doing is insisting that there be black lawyers and other professionals who represented the city in major matters. This created a market for black lawyers in things like the municipal bond business, for example, or representing the city in zoning or land use areas. Some of the black partners had done this work. But they saw as an opportunity that they might be able to do this work cheaper with the same level of effectiveness if they moved into their own institutions without the high level of overhead that many of the large law firms increasingly had. They were also encouraged by a quite remarkable phenomenon, transformation that's happened over the last 30 years, which I sometimes call the browning of the ABA. We have heard that the ABA, we actually haven't heard much about the ABA, but we've heard about the Association of the Bar of the City of New York and other organizations where there was virulent anti-Semitism, virulent nativism that was in all of these organizations. I assure you the ABA, which didn't admit its first black member until 1941, okay, when Brown was beating down its neck, was very much a part of this trend. However,